Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Welcome everybody to the Bible Feed podcast. My name is Laurence and we are continuing our mini-series today on the history of early Christianity. I'm joined again by our friend Stephen. Hello again, and can you just take us through what we're going to be covering in today's session?
Hi Laurence. In this podcast we're going to explore how persecution has played a major role in the history of early Christianity. I appreciate this might sound like quite a somber topic, but what we will see is that there are actually some incredibly powerful and positive points to be gleaned from looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll try and keep it upbeat during today's podcast. Maybe you could give us a brief outline of what we're looking at.
Sure. So we'll start off by looking at the persecution that Jesus taught about and, of course, experienced in his life. Being a disciple of Jesus has amazing rewards, but it also involves significant cost. Next, we will consider a shocking episode of persecution carried out by Emperor Nero in the 1st century AD and see what relevance this has to the truth of the gospel message. Finally, we will consider the Great Persecution carried out by Emperor Diocletian in the 4th century AD, and we'll see that an incredible turn of events took place to bring that particular period of persecution to an end.
Excellent, thank you very much. And as we can see from that, the aspect of persecution is part of the lived experience of Christianity right from early on. So maybe what we'll do is we'll start with that first topic you were looking at and talking about what Jesus taught about persecution. Where do we start?
I think it would be good to look at a passage from the Gospel of Luke. So it's in Luke 21, if you wouldn't mind reading that for us, please, Laurence.
Yeah, sure. So Luke 21, starting at verse 9. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourself, for I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance will you gain your lives. So what are we reading about there? What is that telling us?
What is going on here? So this is part of Jesus' famous Olivet prophecy, Mount Olivet prophecy. It's a fascinating prophecy, but also it's very complex. So I can only give a sort of brief summary here. So basically the disciples of Jesus were asking when the end of the Jewish nation was going to take place. Jesus told them that there would be lots of signs from heaven, indicating that the end was near, the end of the Jewish nation. And he provided a very stark warning for his followers that they would be persecuted. So they'd be hated by all, they'd be betrayed by family members. Some of them would even be put to death. So he was really warning them about what was going to happen before the end was going to come.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And it was really clear from that passage in Luke that it seems really dangerous to be a follower of Jesus. Or when I say dangerous, it wasn't, a club that you join and you get all of these benefits, immediately. There would be difficulties that they would experience, and Jesus, laid it out very clearly that would be the case, and that they needed to give testimony to his name as well, and use it as an opportunity to give testimony to his name. Do we have any record of Jesus' prophecies about persecution coming upon his followers? Does he prophesy about this?
Yes, so we do have a record of some of the persecution that Jesus' followers experience. So that's in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, a book found in the New Testament. So we can read of how Jesus' disciples were, in fact, persecuted, just as Jesus predicted. So some of them were put in prison, some of them were put to death. And these things happened before the end of the Jewish nation, which by and large took place in AD 70. So with this prediction of Jesus, this prophecy of his coming to pass, Jesus gave us reason to believe that he was a prophet, someone who could foretell future events. So it'd probably be good to have a look at an example. Would you mind reading from Acts chapter 7, please, Laurence?
Yeah, absolutely. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. You who received the law as ordained by angels, and yet did not keep it. Now when they heard this, they were cut to the quick, and they began gnashing their teeth at him. But being full of the Holy Spirit, he gazed intently into heaven, and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, Behold, I see the heavens opened up, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice, and covered their ears, and rushed at him with one impulse. When they had driven him out of the city, they began stoning him. And the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. They went on stoning Stephen, as he called on the Lord, and said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And falling on his knees, he cried with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Having said this, he fell asleep.
Thank you, Laurence. So it's a very moving passage, isn't it, about a man called Stephen, and he was passionately preaching the gospel, and he actually ended up doing this at the expense of his life.
Yeah, so we see this, don't we? Like, this is like first century. The gospel is only just starting to gather pace, being spread around to different nations. But even here, we've got this persecution and death, this martyring already starting as a result of people propagating this message about Jesus. So why were they persecuted? What was it that was causing people to rise up against these Christians?
Well, on this occasion, it was the Jewish authorities. So they rejected Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. They persecuted Jesus and ended up putting him to death. So they loved their positions of power. So religion was a huge deal in the first century in ancient Israel, and belief in Jesus was a threat to them. So the more people followed Jesus and believed him to be the Messiah, the less power, respect, and influence these Jewish rulers had. So life was pretty comfortable for them, being the kind of religious elite. And it was bad news if people were believing not in them, essentially, and their way of practicing religion, but choosing to believe in Jesus instead. It was a threat to them. So
in this occurrence, we're seeing the persecution of the Christians coming from basically their the same culture and background as they were coming from. The Jews, the Jewish leaders, the people who held on to the kind of the law of Moses and everything that had surrounded that surrounded it. So maybe we can now think about other sources of persecution. And you mentioned a couple at the beginning in your structure. So let's move on to maybe another source of persecution other than the Jewish rulers.
Yeah, okay. So there was another one, again in the first century AD, but this was Emperor Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero. So he initiated a persecution of Christians, and that took place from AD 64 to AD 68.
So that timescale, we're actually still in the timescale of the Bible there, aren't we? We're looking at the kind of the time of the letters of Paul the Apostle, etc., and Revelation and things like that. So we're still very close to Jesus being around, those apostles delivering this message.
Absolutely. So you got persecution coming from firstly the Jewish rulers, but also not long after coming from elsewhere as well.
So what's the background behind this persecution? Why was Nero against the Christians?
So I'm going to quote now from a historian called Roger Collins. He wrote a book on the history of the papacy, and he wrote about the persecution by Emperor Nero. So he wrote, in AD 64, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, a great fire destroyed much of the centre of Rome. According to the historian Cornelius Tacitus, writing a generation later, the populace believed the emperor had started the fire. And so, to divert attention from himself, Nero initiated a persecution of Christians. Not, however, apparently for arson. First, Nero had self-acknowledged Christians arrested. And then on their information, large numbers of others were condemned, not so much for incendiarism as for their antisocial tendencies. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animal skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutions for daylight. Nero provided his gardens for the spectacle, and exhibited displays in the circus, at which he mingled with the crowd, or stood in a chariot dressed as a charioteer.
I mean, that is just awful. I mean, the things that they endured at that time, we just can't comprehend that. I mean, absolutely tragic. And it seems like Emperor Nero blamed Christians for starting the Great Fire of Rome just to take attention away from himself, and that these deaths described were really awful, so cruel.
Absolutely. So, for whatever reason, the general populace thought that he'd started the fire, and he was willing to do this cruel persecution of Christians just to save his own skin, really. And that really shows what type of person Emperor Nero was. So he inflicted these excruciating executions in these truly horrific ways. And he seemed to really take great pleasure and amusement in these really vindictive actions. So it's quite disturbing, really, what we just read there.
Yeah, and I think, it goes back to some of those words that we read in Luke about what Jesus warned would come. And these people, by Nero, were almost thought of being subhuman, like to treat them in that way. They were really very, very disturbing. So anyway, enough about Nero. Let's move on from that very strange character. And let's think about the Christian martyrs at that time.
Yes, good idea. So although considering this topic of persecution is very sad, it is very somber, there are also really incredibly positive points that can be taken from the example of these Christian martyrs, their example of dying for their faith in Christ. So personally, I find it so humbling and inspiring that so many followers of Jesus were willing to suffer these horrendously painful deaths because they were so devoted and because they were convinced that what they believed was true.
Yeah, and I think if we listen to some of the other podcasts that we've had in previous series is around the resurrection, that's also one of the evidences that the resurrection is true, is because people held this belief. They were very sincere about holding this belief, and it wasn't held for their own benefit, and therefore that adds weight to the fact that it was really true, that Jesus died and was resurrected. So evidence of the truth of Christianity really early on in the experiences of the followers of Christ. But the question is, there's lots of different faiths that have died for their beliefs. It's not just Christians who have died for their beliefs. Others have as well. Mm-hmm. What makes these martyrs of Christianity different?
That's important to acknowledge. Lots of people have given their lives in the past, and people are giving their lives today for their religion that they sincerely believe to be true. So it's a great question to ask, what's so different about these early Christian martyrs? So I would say what sets them out as particularly special and interesting from a faith point of view is that their martyrdom occurred so close to the central claim of Christianity, that God raised Jesus from the dead. So it's plausible that some of these Christians who died in Nero's persecution were alive at the time of Jesus. So some of them may have even seen the risen Jesus. We don't know that for sure. There's no record of that. Just stating that it's possible based on when Jesus was around and when Nero's persecution took place. So if Christianity is essentially a lie, so if the early disciples of Jesus knew for certain that Jesus hadn't really been raised from the dead, maybe they just hid his body, for example, it doesn't make any sense why people would be willing to give their lives for this lie. So to quote Gary Habermas, who wrote the excellent book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, he wrote, "Liars make poor martyrs. Liars make poor martyrs." So if the early Christians knew that Jesus hadn't been raised from the dead, do you really think they would be willing to be torn to pieces by dogs or set on fire? Of course not. They would have just instantly recanted their beliefs, admitting that it was all a lie. So I'd say what sets these martyrs apart is that they died within the central claim of Christianity, a claim that they clearly, passionately believed to be true, and were therefore willing to give their lives for. And if they were so convinced that it was true, we have to ask ourselves, or we can ask ourselves the question, why? Why were they so convinced that it was true? And I suggest that's because of the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection of Jesus.
That's a great summary, Stephen. Thank you. And I think that's something that we've covered a couple of times in our podcast series. And I think that idea of them being so close to the events, the witnesses, and the sincerity of their held beliefs, it meant that they really sincerely held these beliefs. And then you put that evidence together with other pieces of evidence, and you start to build a really strong case for the resurrection of Jesus. So lots of positive things to look at from a really dark period of history of Christianity, and suffering a lot at the hands of Nero and those associated with him, which is good. So that's the kind of the second part that we looked at. We looked at Jesus, we looked at Nero, and we said that we would look at some events at the time of Diocletian. So maybe we can move on to that now.
Yeah, sure. So the Emperor Diocletian started in 303 AD, so right at the start of the 4th century. So it was quite a long persecution, and there's a large number of Christians believed to have perished in it. And because of that, it has become known as the Great Persecution. It continued under his successors as well, but with differing kind of degrees of enthusiasm, if you like, across the empire. Then this persecution, the Great Persecution, came to an end in 312 and 313 AD. So it lasted about 9 or 10 years, and thousands of Christians died in it.
Yeah, and I was doing some reading as part of my preparation for this session, and it was describing the way in which this Great Persecution started. So you've got this east and west splitting of Rome, and Diocletian trying to work out why some of the oracles of his pagan gods were not working, and he was told that the reason was that some of the people in the congregation were crossing themselves, and that it was disrupting the oracles of these gods. And as a result of that, he then started dismantling churches, killing the clergy, and the effect of that spread, throughout to varying degrees throughout the Roman Empire at the time. As you got away from the kind of central portions of power, I think the effects were less. So when you get to England, it's slightly less. They were starting to dismantle churches, but not necessarily killing people. But a huge impact, isn't it, from like an individual having a problem with Christianity, and the ripple effect of persecution that comes from that across the then known world.
Yeah, horrendous period for anyone who lived through it or sadly gave their lives for it.
You said that it lasted for about 10 years. How did the Great Persecution come to an end?
Well, it came to an end due to one of the most amazing and the most unlikely events in all of history taking place, in my opinion. So that would be that a Roman emperor actually converted to Christianity.
So this is the famous conversion, and it's incredible, isn't it, that you've got, like, in AD 68, something like that, we have Nero so against Christianity. Now we're actually saying that a Roman emperor is converting to Christianity. Tell us about the circumstances around that.
So I'll quote from Collins's book again, as he spins this yarn well. So beside a bridge over the Tiber just north of Rome, a battle was fought on 28th of October 312 AD that changed the history of Christianity. The outcome would also have a dramatic impact on the bishops of Rome, turning them into functionaries of the state that had long persecuted them. The relationship with the civil power, previously one of wary neutrality or occasional hostility, would be transformed as Christianity became the religion first of an emperor and then of the whole empire. The battle that had such far-reaching consequences was the product of rivalry between two of the four emperors then controlling the Roman world, part of a process that by 324 AD would see one of them, Constantine I, sometimes referred to as Constantine the Great, emerge as sole ruler of the empire. He was proclaimed emperor in York in 306 AD, controlling Britain, Gaul and Spain. He took the first step on that road by invading Italy, ruled by his brother-in-law Maxentius. Just before the battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a dream in which he was told to mark the heavenly sign of God on the shields of his soldiers. This was how the tutor to the emperor's son recorded the event 3 years later, by which time Constantine's conversion to Christianity had been publicly acknowledged. A decade later in the East, a far more elaborate account involving the vision of a cross in the sky that was also seen by some of his soldiers was published by one of the emperor's theological advisors. Despite contradictions, both narratives make the battle with Maxentius into the turning point in transforming Constantine into the first Christian emperor.
There we go. And I think whatever commentator you read on this, there'll be slightly varying different accounts of exactly how it happened. Was it the dream, or did he actually turn to Christianity then, or was he just friendly towards Christians? And I think the key thing is that in 312 there was a battle between Constantine I and his brother-in-law Maxentius to determine who would become the sole emperor, and this was a momentous event in Rome's history. And in this battle, Constantine presumably had this dream. He saw a vision and took this as a sign to convert to Christianity. I think also he had some Christian relatives as well. I think there was some relatives of his that were followers of Christianity. I think one of his family members was called Anastasis or something like that, which I believe is the word resurrection. So there was a link there between Christianity and his family, and obviously this event was, brought up as this momentous event in Rome's history. And yeah, great news for Christians.
Yeah, to begin with, it was certainly great news as Constantine converting to Christianity. He proclaimed religious toleration with something called the Edict of Milan. So this brought about the end of the persecution that had taken place by Diocletian and his successors. So it's good news for Christians that the persecution came to an end. However, the Roman emperor becoming Christian was a huge step in the direction of a state church. So it only actually took until 380 AD for Christianity to be declared the only legitimate religion of the Roman Empire, which again, if you said to someone in the 1st century AD, or even at the start of the 4th century AD, one day there's going to be a Christian Roman emperor, and one day Christianity will become the only legitimate religion of the empire, it would have seemed so unbelievably unlikely, but that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and that's like 70 or 80 years after the Great Persecution. So it's not long, is it? It's like the lifetime of a person, and you've gone from like institutionally against Christianity institutionally proclaiming Christianity as the religion. So massive switch there between those two positions. And we talked a little bit last time about this situation of the church state, and this is like the beginning of that. We talked about it when we were discussing baptism. And it sounds like it's great news if you're a Christian and you agree with the religion of the emperor, but not so much if you don't. So it was like if you follow the emperor's religion, both with Diocletian and with Constantine, everything was all goodness. But if you didn't, things were not so rosy.
Yes. So you might think that the Roman emperor becoming Christian, that's just going to be great for Christians. But as we'll see from this final quotation, that might not have been the case if you didn't agree with his sort of version of Christianity, if you like. So Emperor Theodosius, officially declared Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire on 27th of February 380 AD, thus bringing the movement begun by Constantine the Great full circle. The formerly persecuted sect now became a state church, with the power and, according to some, the duty to suppress or control its rivals. A religious community once harbouring diverse strands of belief became an orthodoxy, committed to doctrinal unity and the extinction of heresy. And the loose, decentralised organisation of the earlier church gave way to a more hierarchical structure, with power concentrating in the hands of a few great bishops. So, with Constantine converting to Christianity and eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire changing to Christianity, we're left with a situation that was extremely different from how Christianity started. And the question we might like to ask ourselves is whether we think this state church exercising power to persecute those they deemed to be heretics, etc., was faithfully imitating the same religion as that which Jesus practiced. So obviously, by the way I've framed that question, I think it was a very different religion which was emerging here, and sometimes showed itself to be the very antithesis of authentic Christianity. So political power and status can bring out the very worst of human nature. Just like we saw at the beginning with the Jewish rulers persecuting the first Christians, their positions of power led to great acts of evil being committed, and that was sometimes the case with this with the state church coming about.
Just to map the rise of Christianity and the changes in Christianity over just those first 200 or 300 years. We see a massive rise in popularity, and we see obviously these moments of persecution. But in that kind of rise of popularity, it's obviously been taken by the leadership of the then known world and used as an instrument in order to achieve political stability and for people to be controlled. So it's very different, isn't it, from that church which was in the in Acts chapter 2, we learn about them going from house to house, breaking bread, and all in unity in one accord. In Acts chapter 2, this group of like 3,000 to 5,000 people in Jerusalem that start to learn about the gospel and to respond to it. And now we've got this enormous church-state organizational structure with very hierarchical structure, rather than these small pockets of autonomous, controlled churches or ecclesias kind of dealing with their own particular problems. Very different circumstances, very different structures. So yeah, really interesting to take us through that. Thank you, Stephen. So on this journey we've been through, we've looked at what Jesus told the disciples about persecution. We saw that actually happen. We saw it happen in AD 70. We saw the persecution of Nero. We saw the persecution of Diocletian. We saw the rise of Christianity coming to this church state power. But what lesson do we learn through that journey through time?
So I would say that we learn from church history that certain actions have been carried out by those who profess to follow Christ that aren't in keeping with his teaching or example. So Jesus never encouraged his followers to gain political power, to start a state church, or persecute those who didn't convert. For example, the religion that Jesus taught about and practiced is found in the Bible, predominantly in the New Testament, and that's why it's so important for us to value what the Bible teaches if we want to follow the example of Jesus. Another way of describing that would be being a disciple of Jesus may sometimes involve being persecuted, but it should never involve being the one doing the persecuting.
Okay, that's a really good summary, Stephen. Thank you. And I think this idea of getting back to authentic Christianity and looking at the first century, which was built on principles from the Old Testament, is the same theme as we saw last time when we were looking at baptism. It's the same theme coming through here, isn't it, with persecution and the development of the power structure around the state church. So thank you. So we look forward to the final episode in this series with Stephen, and we're going to have a look at another aspect of the history of early Christianity. What are we going to be covering next time, Stephen?
So in the final episode in this mini-series, we will consider the organisation of the early church and ask the question, what did being a member of the church involve at the beginning of Christianity? And we'll see that changed over time. So the organisation of the church was run very differently. We've touched on that at the end of this episode, but it was very different right at the beginning.
Okay, great. So we'll see that development right from the times of the apostles all the way through to our current time, hopefully, and learn some lessons, I'm sure, along the way. So thank you very much for leading us and guiding us through this topic.
My pleasure.
So thank you everybody for listening. Please subscribe on Facebook and Instagram at Bible Feed Online. Go to our website, which is biblefeed.org, and let us know what your thoughts are on this topic, on any future topics that you'd like to hear us consider on the podcast. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions, or subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.